This deals with another heuristic. So the first heuristic we looked at was representativeness, right? And that has to do with our reliance on stereotypes or other sort of easy to represent information. And that happens at the expense of using even numerical quantitative information that we know we should use that is accurate, like base rates. So now we're going to focus our attention to this other heuristic, the availability heuristic. Availability is the use of ease of retrieval. So in other words, how easy is it to remember something? That becomes the basis for judging how common something is. If I can think of it easily, if I can remember it very easily, then it must be very common. And so we find that it's much easier to think of words that begin with a given letter, like the letter K, than words that have K as a third letter. And so this was one of the studies that was done by Tversky and Kahneman to elaborate on how people's use of retrieval can influence their answers to questions like this. And so because it's easier to think of a word that starts with a K, it gives you the false impression that there are actually more words with a K as the first letter, when in fact there are more words with K as the third letter. And in the study by Tversky and Kahneman, they found that 70% of students who were asked this question estimated there were more words that begin with K. But this has important applications for very important decisions that people might make. And so let's take a look at some of the contexts where this has been found. So I'm relying on this website by the Decision Lab. It has a nice little summary here of the availability heuristic. We tend to think that things that happened recently are more likely to happen again. And so we can see here a nice definition of the availability heuristic. Your memory, your recall becomes the basis for judging how likely something is to happen in the future. So a way of thinking about it is that we make decisions based on what we remember. We assume our memories are a representative sample of reality, and we discount events. In other words, we sort of exclude events that are outside of our immediate recollection. There are some important ramifications of this. If you've just seen a movie or some kind of documentary about shark attacks, you are probably more likely to believe that a shark attack is a very common event and likely to happen. That is an example. It can change and it can influence your estimate of how risky it is to do something. If you've seen this documentary recently about shark attacks, you're going to be much more cautious in the water, much more likely to think that a shark attack is a common event. Another example has to do with just purchasing insurance, right? So people purchase insurance because they want to protect themselves from something that might happen, like a natural disaster. They're more likely to purchase insurance to protect themselves after a natural disaster that they have just experienced than they are to purchase insurance on this type of disaster before it happens. Why? Because going through one like that or seeing one happen on the news makes it easy to think of, easy to remember, makes you believe that then it's more common and likely to happen again in the future. Similarly, in terms of medical decision making, doctors that have diagnosed 2 cases of a serious disease are likely to see it in the next patient if they have similar symptoms, even if the patient only has a much milder illness. So that can lead to improper treatment. So this is true even if the disease is somewhat rare. If they have 2 diagnoses of it, then they're going to be at risk at diagnosing it falsely in patients who have similar symptoms, even though it's probably not likely. And so there's a lot of examples of how people falsely judge the likelihood of an event based on what's happened in the past and how easy it is to remember something. So that's the definition of availability heuristic. It can be a harmful force in our lives. It can make us fear events that are rare, like plane crashes. That's another one that's common. And fail to anticipate and thereby prevent more frequent dangers like the development of alcohol poisoning. So in general, you're much more likely to be in a car crash than in a plane crash. You're much more likely to die from a car crash than from a plane crash. But because plane crashes get a lot of media attention and they're very scary, after 1 or 2 plane crashes, people will become very afraid of flying on a plane, but not that afraid of driving in a car, even though, again, the car is much more risky. The availability heuristic also contributes to superstitious beliefs, such as, here's a just a simple example, whenever I forget to carry an umbrella, it rains. So why is that? Think a little bit about why that would be. Right? So if it get caught without an umbrella and you get soaked, that is going to be really memorable, right? Yeah. And so you're going to notice that connection. But on another day that you may have remembered your umbrella and it rained and you didn't get soaked, you're not going to remember that 2 or 3 days later, right? Another thing that seems to influence our decision making is this effect called anchoring. Anchoring usually has to do with quantities, and it has to do with the initial value that's provided. And that initial value becomes such a powerful reference that they will base their decision making on that initial number. So I just recently was called by a nonprofit looking for a donation. They asked me how much I wanted to give, and they started off with like $100, $50, $30, and so on. So they went from high to low. And that is a really common thing for fundraising. And so here we have option A that starts off with $1,500. And here we have option B that starts off with $50. So option A, the first number, becomes the anchor. And that sort of becomes the basis that people will use to figure out how much they're going to donate. And when given this set of numbers, starting with this higher $1,500 number, people will donate a larger amount than if they're started off with the smaller $50 amount, and then the value goes up. So start off with a larger value and you'll end up with a bigger donation than if you start off with a smaller value. Same thing for salespeople when they are selling, say, TVs or any large item, kind of expensive item, or a car, or anything like that. You want to start off with the most expensive one. Even if you know that person has no likelihood or very little likelihood of buying that very expensive one, you start off with that expensive item, and then it makes a lower priced item seem just much less expensive, and they're more likely to spend more on television or on an appliance than they would otherwise. So here's an interesting study that was done looking at the effects of anchoring, and the effects are pretty dramatic. So they had 2 groups of participants that were asked to judge whether, the Mississippi River is long or shorter than some distance. So one group was asked to determine whether the Mississippi River is long or shorter than 500 miles, and the other group was asked to determine whether it was long or shorter than 5,000 miles. So this number, 500 versus 5,000, is the anchor, and you can see that the number was either low or high. The actual length of the Mississippi is in between, 2,348 miles long, right? The 500-mile group estimated that the river was only 1,000 miles. The 5,000-mile group was much closer to the true value of 2,000 miles. But you can see the important idea is that there is a 1,000-mile difference in those estimates depending on what the initial value given was. This phenomenon is called anchoring and adjustment because the initial number anchors people to a starting point, and then they make adjustments from that point. So you're always sort of tethered to that initial number. This anchoring effect occurs even when participants know that the starting number is totally false, or believe that the starting number was randomly selected, like if a wheel was spun and generated the number. So even if they know that the starting number, that initial anchor, isn't valid, doesn't have any meaning, they still rely on it. With the use of these heuristics that we've seen, representativeness and availability, and then now anchoring, we can see that people are sometimes not reasoning as accurately as they should. And that's because these heuristics represent a type of thinking that is sometimes categorized as System 1. And we've seen this before. We've already talked about automatic processing, where we did the Stroop test, and that led us to talking about how some things we do automatically, some processes just happen automatically. Well, these heuristics are done automatically, so they are an example of automatic processing. And again, System 1 is kind of a phrase that's used to refer to this type of thinking that's automatic, based on what worked before, using these easy shortcuts to thinking. And it contrasts with System 2, which is familiar to us in terms of a controlled process, right? Controlled processing that is much more effortful, takes a lot more concentration, maybe uses math, and is going to demand a lot more of us. So when the more reflective, sort of effortful processing of System 2 is the one that takes over, it's usually because it inhibits the heuristics used by System 1. So automatic processing, System 1 is sort of the default for us. And we can be, making mistakes because of that. And so System 2 has to sort of step in and say, whoa, I'm not going to use these representativeness or availability heuristics. I'm not going to be influenced by this anchor, and then use more